From Tunisia to Egypt, ordinary citizens have taken to the streets in a wave of popular uprisings known as the Arab Spring. At the forefront, the youth of the country, who are seizing the power of new technology and social media to help change history. We take you to Egypt, where you will meet one such extraordinary person. The national colours of Egypt are everywhere, hanging off balconies, on T-shirts and flags, painted on the face of children. It's a celebration here at Tahrir Square, in Egypt's capital Cairo, where one of the largest crowds has gathered since an uprising toppled their country's ruling regime a few months before, in January 2011.
In my whole life, I never imagined seeing what I saw then. To be able to see the huge number of people protesting in one place was a great shock to me. People were finally awake.
Mohammed Gamal, better known by his web nickname Jemmy Hood, is a blogger, cartoonist, musician, and political activist. He's one of the hundreds of thousands of Egyptians who rallied to overthrow an authoritarian regime decades old. He's also one of thousands of young Egyptians who used a new kind of tool in the fight for change, the power of new technology and social media.
We can now use the internet as a tool for change and not a tool to dream about change. We were all unified to fight the system. We all wanted a real democracy.
One of the most populous nations in both Africa and the Middle East, Egypt is a key player in the stability and future of both regions. Some half of its population live in sprawling urban areas such as Cairo, a metropolitan area that now encompasses the only remaining wonder of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid of Giza. But the grandeur of this nation's history has been at odds with its political reality, where stability came at the expense of political and social freedom. Since 1981, with the assassination of its former president Anwar Sadat, the country has been in a state of emergency. Constitutional rights were suspended, censorship imposed, and police repression legalized. It was a reality that Jemmy knew all too well, a reality that ignited his political activism. In 2002, he was jailed and beaten by the police, he says, for the crime of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He began pursuing a career as a singer in South Sinai in northeastern Egypt, where he says the police would often conduct arbitrary mass arrests.
They broke into my room and arrested me.
The police took him and forced him back to Cairo. For 13 days, he says, he was repeatedly beaten.
I didn't know why I was arrested or why I was beaten, and even now I'm not sure why. They wouldn't even bother to question us. We were only beaten.
Statements against the government weren't allowed on the web under Egypt's regime, then led by former President Hosni Mubarak. Before the advent of social media, it wasn't possible to hold an open political discussion. But Jemmy and so many others were determined not to let that stop them from expressing themselves. So Jemmy seized all available web tools to try to bypass censorship and demand change.
This was a big jump for me, to become more political. I began with what was the best available option then, the internet, on forums and chat rooms.
He began blogging about the need to reject the current political system, also using his drawings and cartoons on his blog. And he wasn't the only one. After 2005, a growing number of underground cartoonists also started to use their art for political activism. Often forbidden from being published in print, many would post their political cartoons online and use them in demonstrations.
People started getting used to seeing the comic strips that would talk against the system, against the government. Modern comics use street language to reach common people.
As well as using more accessible language, comics, Jemmy says, are simple and direct in their message, and their humour a tool to raise people's consciousness about the government's oppressive actions. Humour was also used in internet videos to encourage the youth movement. Ali Kandil, seen here with Jemmy, is a comedian who became an internet celebrity after several of his satirical videos went viral on YouTube.
I wrote that the revolution brought back a genuine sense of humor to the Egyptian people. This means that this nation can produce comedy from tragedy.
Jemmy also began using his singing to express his discontent. He and his group performed political songs. These videos also went viral on the web, and his group got national attention.
We were interviewed by so many TV programs and newspapers, and people started to memorize our songs.
But Jemmy's political determination would take even stronger shape after he was picked to take part in the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations Fellowship Program for Young Leaders, and he got to travel to the United States and Europe. There he was exposed to new political ideas and saw freedom of expression in action.
We got to visit places that I never dreamt of visiting. I visited the BBC, France 24, CNN. It was my first experience participating in political forums and interacting with important politicians.
Jemmy even trained Arab journalists on how to use social media to promote freedom of speech and social justice. And back in Egypt, he was hired by an important opposition newspaper. Mohammed Fawzi was the newspaper's assistant editor at the time.
Bloggers then had really become like stars. The newspaper wanted to benefit from their popularity and reached out to them.
And those bloggers, meanwhile, were watching with great interest what was happening in another North African country nearby, Tunisia. When their revolution began in December 2010, it was an inspiration to Jemmy and so many others.
People were encouraged when they saw what was happening in Tunisia. It would have not been the same if it had happened in Europe, for example, and not in the Arab world.
And so, a month later, on January 25th, 2011, Egyptians like Jemmy took their revolution to their own streets.
The streets were closed, but we decided to move towards Tahrir Square. We were moving in huge numbers. We ran so fast and broke through the police lines. This was the happiest moment in my life because I felt that we can really do it. I started calling my friends and telling them about the overwhelming events, and I started crying.
Jemmy stayed on the front lines of the revolution for 17 days. During the clashes with police, the gas bombs, the high-pressure fire hoses, and the beatings. He and others used non-violent resistance strategies when possible. But when necessary, they also used confrontation techniques Jemmy learned as a football fan during clashes with stadium security. All the while, he struggled to stay connected to his followers on the web. Unable to blog, he tweeted short messages, and when the chaos was too great and he couldn't tweet, he phoned others to do it for him.
It was a game of endurance between us and the police, enduring and waiting to see who would surrender. That was the revolution.
The government shut down the entire internet, but it was too late. And just 2 weeks after the first demonstration, victory for the people.
President Mohammed Hosni Mubarak has decided to waive the office of the President of the Republic.
But even as the crowd celebrated at the square, Cemi knew his nation's newfound democracy was still to be settled.
The real test is whether the people will use democracy in the right way. Only then we will know the outcome of what we began with our revolution.
And a few months after the uprising, back at Tahrir Square at the celebratory gathering, it's time for noon prayers. It's a moment of unity and quiet reflection, of silence and collective clamour. It is a moment of peace. But that was about to change. Also at the square, protesters who are here to demand that justice be brought to members of the old regime. And as evening falls, many of those protesters decide to stay for a sit-in at the square in direct defiance of a military-imposed curfew that has existed since the uprising. From there, things quickly unravel.
We heard heavy gunfire on the other side of the square.
Salma Saeed is a friend of Cemi's and a fellow activist and blogger.
Immediately, people started running because the army started running towards them and started firing in the air. It was almost a battlefield. People were so determined that they are not going to leave the square.
The celebrations seem like a distant past as Cemi meets Salma at the square the next day. The remnants of battle lay all around them. The barbed wire, the piles of rocks thrown at the army. The burnt-out trucks and buses still fume as a woman cries for her disappeared son. A demonstrator shows us his wounded body. Protesters display fired ammunition, and passers-by argue over who's to blame for the clash. But Cemi, who once again begins tweeting to thousands about what he sees in front of him, refuses to be discouraged. For him, what happened here is just a painful step in the process of an enduring democracy.
This is expected, since there are always stages in any revolution that one must get through.
And Cemi's already looking forward to the next stage of the revolution, to ensure that all Egyptians get a voice, fair representation, and their rights recognized. The issues, he says, are plenty. But for most of the young people who took part in the uprising, the process in itself has already proven to be an extraordinary experience.
I believe that this revolution should continue for 25 years, not just days. We have a long list of demands that the people will not give up on. Whoever has tasted freedom after 30 years of oppression will never want to go back. We are writing history.